August 8, 1969, unknown intruders broke into the fashionable Los Angeles home of movie director Roman Polanski and his pregnant wife, actress Sharon Tate. There they slaughtered her and 4 others. One night later, another home was invaded, and a middle-aged grocery executive and his wife were killed with equal brutality. In 2 days, an entire city was seized by fear. But it was months before the crimes were connected. When they were, a small bizarre character named Charles Manson was charged with provoking his apparently fanatic followers to commit the crimes, and a national obsession to understand these people began. Who was Charles Manson? As he recalls it, the pain of Charles Manson's childhood began early.
I'm a street child. I'm a runaway little girl at 15 years old out of Kentucky named Kathleen Maddox. I didn't have a husband. My husband's name was Scott. And he married somebody else and went down the road, and she went to Cincinnati and had a guy named Charlie Manson.
Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, in Cincinnati General Hospital. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 and unmarried when he was born. His father was a Colonel Scott who'd briefly known Kathleen.
She was very, very motherly looking. She was as motherly looking as my mother was.
My mother went to prison for 5 years for strong-arm robbery. Her brother had to deal a trick in off the street and put the yoke on him to get some money to eat.
But when I heard she was a prostitute, it just, I couldn't believe that either.
And she went to prison, and I used to visit her in the prison visiting room.
His mother's absence and rejection would make a life with her a dream of Charles Manson's throughout his childhood. Manson spent many of his early years in the small town of McMecken, West Virginia, with his deeply religious aunt and uncle, living by all appearances a not unhappy small-town life.
The house was a big, older house, but it was beautiful. He had just about anything he wanted, I would say. His aunt and uncle and grandmother took him to church. He didn't like going. The only thing he really liked, was the singing. But Charles loved to sing.
But some of Manson's outlook on the world came from another uncle, a mountain man.
Out of the Kentucky mountains, when my uncle said, "We ain't surrendered, we're still rebels, and we'll be rebels until the end of time, because I ain't accepting no Yankee school." He said, "Don't go to those schools, boy." So when I was 9 years old, I set the school on fire, and I went to reform school.
Between 1942 and 1947, Manson spent periods of time with his mother and her assorted lovers around the Midwest. But then, unable to place him in a foster home, she allowed the court to place him in the Gibault School for Boys. After 10 months, he ran away to find her, but she would not take him back. This was a turning point for Charles Manson.
The only thing my mother taught me was that everything she said was a lie. And I learned never to believe anyone about anything.
He ran away from school again and began a life of petty crimes, including breaking into grocery stores and stealing a bicycle. In 1949, after time in a juvenile center, he was sent to Father Flanagan's famous Boys Town. According to a 1949 article in the Indianapolis News, a dead-end kid who has lived in an emotional blind alley is happy today. He's going to Boys Town. Manson ran away 4 days later. Now just 13, he stole cars, broke into stores, and committed his first armed robberies. He was then sent to the Indiana School for Boys, where he claims he was raped and repeatedly beaten. He ran away 18 times. Now, the punishments escalated after he stole cars, committed armed robbery, and held up gas stations. He went from the National Training School for Boys to Natural Bridge Camp to federal reformatories at Petersburg, Virginia, and Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was paroled in 1954. He was just 19 years old. his way of looking at the world.
See, I never realized that people outside are much different than the people inside. People inside, if you lie, you get punched. You get misused. You don't lie to the lieutenant. Lieutenant don't lie to you. There's a certain amount of truth in prison, and being raised in prison, I was raised pretty much in the light of that truth.
He did his own time. He pretty much refused to be programmed to go along with the expectations of the prison staff. He apparently spent a lot of time in his cell playing the guitar, writing music. He did attend a class, did very well in a power of positive thinking class, which I always thought was a part of his style.
He was released from prison in 1967. It's been said that he asked not to be released. He'd now spent more than half of his 32 years inside, and prison was the only real home he'd ever known. What's more, Charles Manson had never known life with a real family. That would make a family of his own very appealing. Prison may have meant a life of little change for Charles Manson, but life outside was changing radically. It was a far different world now from the one he'd known before prison, and was one where his particular skills would serve him well. It was the mid-1960s, and the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco was, for hippies and others escaping the mainstream, the promised land.
What we saw at its peak were literally thousands of flower children all over the country, all over the world, attracted to this movement, like moths to a flame. You know, summer in San Francisco. There was a philosophy here that was totally revolutionary that they'd not heard before, and this was the epicenter of it. A lot of very young, creative, exploring people came there, but then you started to see a shift where more disturbed, sicker, more drug-involved people started to come. Then you started to see a shift where more disturbed, sicker, more drug-involved people started to come.
The hallucinogenic drugs like LSD were being replaced by stimulant drugs, speed particularly, that led to compulsion and paranoia, and innocence was giving way to violence.
You may recall a song, the lyrics of which were, if you come to San Francisco, you better wear a flower in your hair. By 1967, if you came to San Francisco, you needed to wear a .45 in your belt. It had changed that fast. The kids were still coming from all over the United States with the same set of expectations, but the welcoming committee was very, very different. There was a brand of street theater that was hard to imagine.
If we are coming up to the beatnik area, all the stores out in this area, they're taken over by the beatniks, and we see them in all shapes and sizes. I think this one is a girl walking in front of us. She has a hair ribbon, but it's hard to tell.
It was a scene where if you grew your hair and talked the talk, you fit in.
This was the scene which Charles Manson entered on his release from prison in 1967.
When he came out, he initially told me that there was nothing I could do, that that he could go back to prison. He was not afraid of it. He was not going to do parole if parole was going to be onerous. He was clearly an antisocial personality. He was superficial, he was glib, and he was very adaptable.
And when I got out, all your children would come to me because they never had anybody to tell them the truth.
He sized up people, I think, fairly quickly and fairly accurately. I think that's a skill you learn in prisons.
He said, so your father just kicked you out of the house. And that started it.
Lynette Squeaky Fromm joined up with Manson early on.
It was easy to talk to him. And we talked on a number of levels. His mind intrigued me.
Charlie was what he needed to be.
I realized that people outside are much different than the people.
On the night of August 9th, 1969, at a house on Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, actress Sharon Tate, wife of movie director Roman Polanski and 8 months pregnant, was at home with her friends, the hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and Roman's friend Wojtek Frykowski. A young man named Stephen Parent was also on the site, visiting the home's caretaker. That night's murders began with some preparations at Spawn Ranch.
I was with the children. We were in a trailer. I was with someone else, and we were in a trailer. And Charlie came and woke me up. And he said, "Get up. I want you to go somewhere." He said, "Get in the car." And I was in the car with Tex and Linda Kasabian and Susan Atkins. And he said, "Do everything that Tex says." And we were off.
Tex Watson went onto the property first. When he came upon Stephen Parent in his car, he shot him 4 times.
We heard gunshots. He came back and told us to come with him, and we followed. Trying to get into the house, he eventually, I think he went through a window or something, returned to a front door and allowed the rest of us to enter. There was a man that he was dealing with, and I think that was Jay Sebring, I believe. He had him on the floor or something, and he was going to tie him up. And he asked Susan to check the back rooms. And what began to happen is a scuffle started taking place between Tex and the man and Jay Sebring, and he shot him. And everyone else at that point obviously was getting really frightened and scared. And what eventually took place is that there was an attempt to tie everyone up. And when there was an attempt to tie everyone up, eventually Abigail Folger started to get herself undone, and she took off. I ran after her with an upraised knife, and we went out through a back door out onto the lawn. And I started stabbing her. I ran her down, and I began to stab her. I remember her saying, "I'm already dead."
It was Tex Watson who delivered most of the fatal blows at the house that night.
We were so locked in, it's just okay, this must be this, and you just become more in more like a robot, somehow this must bring it.
The scene left behind was grotesque. There was blood everywhere. A rope tied twice around Sharon Tate's neck was looped over a beam and tied around Jay Sebring's neck. Abigail Folger and Wojtek Frykowski lay on the front lawn. Stephen Parent lay dead in his car. And on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood was the word pig. Besides being shot and bludgeoned, the victims had been stabbed a total of 102 times.
When I got back to the ranch, we got out of the car, Charlie came up and asked everybody how it went. But that was the first time I looked at him and I said, "Charlie, they were so young." And he just said, "Go with Tex."
The next night,